For nearly 2 decades, a sealed tube sat inside an evidence freezer in Los Angeles. It contained a sample taken from an apparent bite mark on the arm of a murdered woman. In 1986, science could not identify whose saliva it contained. Years later, it would reveal something almost impossible to believe. The person connected to that evidence had not disappeared. She had continued working inside the Los Angeles Police Department. She carried a badge. She investigated crimes. And for 23 years, no one arrested her for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. On February 24, 1986, Sherri was found dead inside the Van Nuys home she shared with her husband. The rooms appeared disturbed. Her car was gone. Stereo equipment had been placed near an exit. Detectives believed she had surprised burglars and died during a violent struggle. But the scene contained details that did not fit. Very little had been taken. There was no clear forced entry. And on Sherri's arm was the injury that would eventually destroy the burglary theory. A bite mark. It preserved the DNA of a woman. That woman was Detective Stephanie Lazarus. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old. She was a registered nurse and hospital administrator in Glendale, California. Friends and relatives described her as intelligent, accomplished, athletic, and committed to her work. In June 1984, Sherri met John Rutan. Their relationship became serious, and in May 1985 they became engaged. They married that November and moved into a condominium on Balboa Street in Van Nuys. But John had a complicated history with another woman. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. John and Stephanie had known each other since college. They had dated casually and had also been sexually involved, although John later said he had not considered her his girlfriend. By the time John committed to Sherri, Stephanie had joined the LAPD. When she learned about the engagement, she was devastated. According to later court testimony, Stephanie called John crying and asked him to reconsider. At one point after the engagement, John met with her and they had sex. He nevertheless continued his relationship with Sherri. Stephanie later confronted Sherri at the hospital where she worked. Sherri came home upset, and John admitted what had happened. He promised there would be no further contact. Sherri and John went ahead with their wedding. 3 months later, Sherri was dead. Monday, February 24th, began as an ordinary workday. John left the condominium at approximately 7:20 in the morning. Sherri was scheduled to work, but called the hospital and said she was sick. She remained home alone. Beginning around 10 a.m., John and Sherri's sister tried calling the house. No one answered. At approximately 9:45, a neighbor noticed that the garage door was open and neither car was inside. Around noon, 2 men gave the neighbor a purse they had found. It belonged to Sherri. At approximately 6 that evening, John returned home. The garage was still open. Sherri's BMW was missing. Broken glass from a sliding patio door was scattered across the driveway. The door connecting the garage to the condominium was partly open. Inside the living room, John found Sherri on the floor. She was still wearing a sleep shirt and robe. She had been beaten and shot 3 times in the chest. Investigators found extensive evidence of a struggle. Sherri had injuries to her hands, face, head, neck, and arms. Pieces of broken fingernails were discovered near the front entrance. A broken vase lay close to her body. A blood-stained white cord was also found nearby. On the inner side of her left forearm was an injury that appeared to have been made by human teeth. The bite had occurred at or near the time of her death. At first, the condominium seemed to tell a familiar story. Stereo equipment had been removed from a cabinet and stacked near the garage door. A drawer had been pulled open. Some belongings had been disturbed. Sherri's BMW had vanished. Detectives theorized that 1 or 2 burglars had entered the home, encountered Sherri, and killed her during a fight. But the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the burglary appeared. There was no convincing evidence of forced entry. Most valuable property remained in the home. The stereo equipment had been prepared for removal, but abandoned. The rest of the condominium had not been thoroughly ransacked. Sherri's BMW was recovered on March 7th, approximately 2.5 miles away. The keys were still in the ignition. The car had not been stripped or seriously damaged. Years later, a prosecution crime scene analyst testified that the home appeared staged to resemble a burglary. There were other clues. Sherri had been shot with a .38 caliber weapon. The ammunition was of a type LAPD officers were required to carry at the time. Stephanie Lazarus owned a short-barreled Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, consistent with the possible murder weapon. Less than 2 weeks after the killing, she reported that revolver stolen in Santa Monica. The weapon was never recovered. None of this alone proved who killed Sherri. And in 1986, the most important evidence could not yet identify anyone. The apparent bite mark was swabbed. The sample was sealed and placed into storage. The case slowly went cold. Sherri's family never accepted that the case was simply a random burglary. They had told investigators about the former woman in John's life and the confrontation at Sherri's workplace. But the original investigation remained focused on unidentified burglars. In December 2004, cold case detectives requested the preserved bite mark evidence. Testing revealed 2 DNA profiles. One belonged to Sherri. The other was a complete profile from an unknown woman. That discovery changed the case. The woman who had bitten Sherri during the fatal struggle did not fit the original theory of male burglars. The profile was entered into the national DNA database. There was no match. Then, in February 2009, detectives reviewed the case again. This time, they focused on women connected to Sherri, who might have had a personal motive. Stephanie Lazarus moved near the top of the list. Investigators watched her and recovered a drinking cup and straw she had discarded. DNA obtained from those items was consistent with the female profile from the bite mark. After her arrest, investigators collected an official sample directly from Stephanie. It matched the bite mark profile across every available location tested. An independent laboratory later confirmed the result, using additional genetic markers. The probability of an unrelated woman sharing the complete profile was extraordinarily remote. The evidence that had waited for years finally had a name. On June 5, 2009, detectives asked Stephanie Lazarus to come to an interview room inside an LAPD building. She was told they wanted to discuss an art theft investigation. The conversation was recorded. Gradually, the detectives changed direction. They asked whether she knew John Rutin. Stephanie said she had known him many years earlier. They asked about his wife and whether she had ever met Sherri. Her answers became cautious. She described John as an old friend and minimized their relationship. She said she could not clearly remember confronting Sherri at the hospital. Then the detectives told her they were investigating Sherri's murder. Stephanie denied any involvement. She did not confess. But detectives already had the evidence they needed. When she left the interview room, officers arrested her in the hallway. A veteran detective, surrounded by colleagues inside a police building, was taken into custody for a murder committed when she had been a young LAPD officer. Searches of her home later uncovered journals, planners, photographs of John, and writings documenting how deeply his relationship with Sherri had affected her. The case was no longer about unknown burglars. It was about a personal motive and biological evidence left on the victim's body. Stephanie Lazarus went on trial in 2012. Prosecutors argued that she confronted Sherri inside the condominium, fought with her, bit her, and killed her. They said the disturbed stereo equipment and missing car were part of an attempt to disguise the murder as a burglary. The defense questioned the age and handling of evidence, pointed to unidentified prints and DNA, and emphasized that the gun was never recovered. But the central evidence remained unchanged. Stephanie's DNA precisely matched the saliva recovered from an injury inflicted during Sherri's struggle with her attacker. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On March 8, 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. In 2015, the California Court of Appeal affirmed the judgment. The conviction answered the largest question in the case, but it could not restore the years that had been lost. Sherri was 29 when she was murdered. Stephanie continued her police career for more than 2 decades before the evidence caught up with her. The case remains a warning about assumptions. A scene can be arranged to tell a false story. A badge can make a suspect appear unlikely. And an investigation can remain trapped inside its first theory for years. But physical evidence does not care about rank, reputation, or time. A small sample preserved on Sherri Rasmussen's arm survived long enough for science to understand it. For nearly 23 years, the truth remained silent inside a sealed tube. Then the evidence finally spoke,